I want to talk about rent. I've always rented. I've never had a mortgage. I've never been eligible. I've never had enough money for deposits. I've never had a job that paid enough. And frankly, I've moved around so much that a mortgage would have been wasted on me anyway. I've never found the place where I could imagine staying. And if I was going to stay somewhere, it would be nearer my parents, and I am pressed right out of that market, so that's never going to happen, which is why I live so far away from them. Rent has often been thought of as a dirty word, poor people rent. If you're any good, then you get yourself a mortgage and you settle down, blah, blah, blah. And that's kind of a sort of pressure that I've had. We don't have conversations about this at home because I don't want to get into those conversations, but my parents are very much, you're wasting your money if you're renting. You haven't made it if you're renting. But they paid off their mortgage like 20 years ago or something, so good for them. My brother has a mortgage with his family, and that makes sense for them because they're still in the same village. They were never going to leave. They need the security. But certainly the last year or so have demonstrated that mortgages aren't always the best option. We know that mortgage rates have gone up a lot because of post-pandemic inflation, etc., etc. And what you forget is that when you take out a mortgage, you are effectively renting from the bank. Until that mortgage is completely paid off, you do not own that property. And from what I've been seeing lately on the news and in documentaries that I've seen coming up in my feed on YouTube, if you don't make those payments, you're out. They will take that away from you, and the legal complications that go with that are more far-reaching and more complicated than if you just rent. So if I stopped being able to pay my rent, or my rent went up so much that I couldn't afford it, or I didn't want to pay for it, all I have to do is give my notice and I leave. There's no repercussions. There's nothing else that goes along with that. If you can't pay your mortgage, your bank or whoever your mortgage is with can and will take your property away. You will still have to pay all the debt that comes with that, which can be a lot. And when they sell the property, any shortfall you still have to pay for. I've been watching documentaries of people who are losing their homes, and they're married couples in work with children, and they can't afford the rises in their mortgages because they're literally living month to month. And they're losing their homes, and the only way they can get out of the enormous debts that come with that is to bankrupt themselves. And that might sound like an answer to the problem. But bankruptcy is not an easy option. I had a friend once who had to make herself bankrupt because she decided to start a business, and she was terrible at business, and she got into debt very quickly. When you are bankrupt, they take everything away from you. You can't have bank accounts. You can't get utilities. As far as a bank account goes, you might get a cash card. You cannot have anything. And it really makes life difficult for you in the future, because that will sit over your head and your credit rating and your credit history with anyone you go to connected to money for a long, long time. I don't mind renting, in part because I do move around quite a lot. I've now been here in this property for almost 5 years, and it's the second longest I've ever been anywhere, and it's certainly the longest I've ever lived where I was entirely responsible. So previously, the longest I'd been anywhere since I left the family home was 8 years, and it wasn't actually my house. I was living with a partner. It was his house, his mortgage, so it was easy to move. I don't anticipate living here forever. Please, God, don't let me be still living in this town in 3 or 4 years' time. But who knows? I have no idea what's coming, what decisions I may need to make, what decisions my landlord might make, how financial situations are going to change. But I also have buffer zones. If the worst situation came to worst and I had to leave here, the chances are I would not find anywhere else to rent. The prices have gone up a lot. I struggle to get cleared for renting because of my employment situation, etc., etc. I got this flat because they bypassed the financial checks in agreement that I would pay 6 months' rent in advance. And I do that every 6 months. I started out on 6 monthly contracts, and after a while they let me go on to a yearly, but I still pay for 6 months' rent. And that's just the way it is. It means I have a roof over my head. But lots of other places I know won't do that, and I lost out on several flats before I found my place to live now because people are uncomfortable at taking that amount of money up front, and many of them won't do it. So the chances are, if I had to leave here, I would end up having to put my stuff in storage, and by that I mean my business stuff, personal stuff like furniture and sofas and things like that. I would probably just get rid of, and I would just keep the essentials, and I would end up moving back to my parents until I could work out what I was going to do. Much as that is not an ideal situation for any of us, I don't want to live there. They don't particularly want me living there. And certainly at my age, that's a step back, but lots of people are doing it. But it means that I'm not living on the street or in my very tiny car. But it means there is a buffer zone, so I'm not panicking every time my rent comes up for renewal. Am I going to end up on the street? That's not going to happen. So that there's never that underlying fear. And frankly, if I did want to stay here and I wanted more money, I could go and get a regular job. Of course I could. I don't know what the job market is like anymore. It's been a while since I've been in it. But I am assuming that I could find something that would top up my existing income enough to tip the balance on income. But I get really annoyed when people talk about rent as wasted money. It's not wasted money if it puts a roof over your head. Yes, you may be paying some landlord's mortgage, but and I'm never going to be able to get a mortgage, so what am I whinging about, Just be thankful you can find somewhere to live, and I'm not actually paying that much by comparison. I was reading a piece on the BBC News recently with someone trying to find themselves a one-bedroom flat in London. No chance. The most awful places are, 16, 17, 1800 a month. Really hideous places. And then she went outside London and couldn't find anywhere. And the queues to view places were astronomical. And she ended up looking in, Nottingham. And you couldn't find anywhere there either. It's really expensive. Just really expensive. And if I left here, I'd be lucky to find somewhere that wasn't at least £300 a month more where I am now, and probably wouldn't get a better standard or a better landlord or a better area, for sure. I don't doubt that for 1 minute. But stop demonising rent. Mortgages, people are losing their homes, and a lot more besides, because mortgages are so complicated. And you do not own that property until you've paid off that mortgage. One thing goes wrong, and it all comes down like a pack of cards, and you can lose that house. It is not yours until you have fully paid it off to whoever you've borrowed that mortgage money off of. It is not yours. You are basically paying rent to whoever gave you the mortgage. And until you have paid it off in full, it is not your property. So don't forget that, and think about that carefully when you're trying, and probably these days failing, to get a mortgage because of the way prices are. It's just a horrific situation. There are families now living in caravans and B&Bs. Single people now living in their cars, even though they have jobs, because their houses were taken away from them. Because, from what I've seen, and we know it, nobody cares. If you get turfed out on the street, all your bank cares about is getting that property back and selling it off. The council doesn't care about rehoming you. There's a list a mile long of people who need council housing, and we don't have council housing. Landlords don't want to take on social housing people anymore because they changed the way the rents work here now, and instead of the rent being paid direct to the landlord, the government had this great idea: let's pay it to the people who are renting and let them pass the money on to the landlord. Well, you know where that ended up. And so landlords just don't rent to social housing now because it's too risky. So that's that. And I just wanted to get that off my chest. Rent is not a bad word. It is not a waste of money if it puts a roof over your head. And it gives you that peace of mind and a little bit of security. A mortgage is a rent. And most people will never pay off their mortgages because very few people will stay in their house for 25 or 30 years. So stop looking at it as, the better option. We're obsessed by owning property in this country. And you won't own it until you've paid it off.